This is the Mathematics Education Podcast from mathedpodcast.com. Welcome to the Math Ed Podcast. I'm Sam Otten from the University of Missouri, and today my guest is a professor of mathematics from Temple University and the author of best-selling books such as Innumeracy, Mathematical Illiteracy and Its Consequences, and A Mathematician Reads the Newspaper, as well as other books. We will be discussing certain aspects of his career and how he brings a mathematical mindset to bear on important facets of modern life. And we will also spend some time talking about his most recent book, which is his unique kind of version of an autobiography, and that's entitled A Numerate Life, available from Prometheus Books. John Allen Paulos, thank you so much for being here.
It's good to be with you, Sam.
So I mentioned your autobiography, A Numerate Life, and I actually wanted to start by reading a short little excerpt from that book because you have a very quick, concise rundown of your life. You kind of pack your whole life into one sentence. So this is from the introduction. I think it'll give us a little bit of background on yourself, and then we can talk about some parts of it. You wrote, quote, "I was born in 1945, grew up in Chicago and Milwaukee, graduated from the University of Wisconsin, went into the Peace Corps to avoid the draft, returned to Madison where I met my beauteous wife Sheila and received my PhD in mathematics, moved to Philadelphia to teach at Temple University, had 2 wondrous children who have recently begotten 3 grandchildren, wrote some books on mathematics, a couple of which were bestsellers, and gradually, as I became less intelligent, became more a writer than a mathematician." So that's quite the summary there, John.
Okay. Well, one correction. It's 4 grandchildren now, not 3.
Oh, that's a nice little update then. That's happy news.
Yeah, right.
And I want to go to one particular little clause in that biography, and that's your PhD in mathematics. So when was it that you decided to go ahead towards a PhD, and then why was it that you decided to do that?
Well, as an undergraduate, I majored in a variety of areas. I majored for a while in English, in physics, philosophy, even classics, but kept returning to math and to a lesser extent philosophy. And Bertrand Russell had been a childhood idol of mine. He was probably a factor in my going into mathematics in general, mathematical logic in particular. I ended up in where I am, in part because of those early decisions.
And one thing I do here on the podcast is I always like to just get on the record the topic of people's dissertations so that listeners sort of have this landscape of what people were doing when they were at the graduate student level. And I know yours is in mathematical logic and things, but maybe in a nutshell you can mention what the focus of your dissertation was and also who you worked with there when you were in grad school.
Sure. I studied model theory in general and the model theory of non-standard logics with quantifiers that say there exists uncountably many or that allow infinite sentences and various other variants on first-order logic, including Lindström's theorem, which characterizes first-order logic as the largest logic, which satisfies countable compactness and downward Löwenheim-Skolem. So, as I say, I gravitated towards logic because it was close to philosophy. It was kind of a general sort of overview of mathematics in a sense. And I stayed in logic for a while, and then in recent years switched over more to probability and statistics. And as that sentence you read indicated, popular writing in more recent years. I work with John Barwise, unfortunately the late John Barwise, and Jerry Kiesler at the University of Wisconsin in Madison.
And you mentioned writing kind of for popular press. You write online and have written, these books that we're going to be talking about. So I wanted to go back to that moment when you decided to start writing books for the public, for a public audience, and bringing some mathematical points of view and sharing it with a broader audience. What was it that led you to make that turn? And I think you kind of started with some mathematics and humor, which is kind of a fun topic. But what was that like to decide to make that move? And also, how did you go about actually getting kind of a book deal and getting published with your first book?
The first book, as you indicated, was entitled Mathematics and Humor. It kind of jibed with my interest in mathematics. I mean, there are mathematical aspects to humor. I mean, both of them involve self-reference, often unusual juxtapositions and permutations and logical paradoxes, incongruities, literal interpretations of things. even reductio ad absurdum, although in humor the emphasis is on the absurdum and in mathematics on the reductio part.
Mhm.
But I was just struck. I've always been struck by the fact that despite their superficially very dissimilar uh, realm of our conceptual landscape, nevertheless, I mean, ingenuity, cleverness are hallmarks of both math and humor. Long-windedness is antithetical to pure mathematics, as it usually is to good humor.
Mhm.
So maybe I'll cut short this this little disposition by
Speaking
not
of
being too
self-referential.
long-winded. But one other aspect is that there's mathematical content to many jokes and puzzles and so on, which also struck me. I mean, a joke I tell in Math and Humor is story of a young man who signs up for an online dating service, and he stipulates he wants a potential spouse who really likes water sports and is very outgoing, gregarious, comfortable in formal wear, a little shorter than average, and the service recommends a penguin. Okay, it's not a hilarious joke, but it does illustrate that. I mean, if you take the young man's requirements for the axioms, then the natural interpretation is a young woman who satisfies those conditions. But the penguin, it provides the axioms with a different and unexpected model.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, non-Euclidean geometry can be considered as a kind of joke in that sense. It's a non-standard model of Euclid's axioms minus the parallel postulate. It's perhaps many people would consider it a stretch, but that's one kind of humor where you have a bunch of conditions and the punchline is a non-standard model of those conditions. But there are a lot of such overlap between math and humor. And I mean, even vector addition. I mean, one thing I do when I'm teaching, I say, okay, imagine that there's a tribe of bear hunters that became extinct shortly after they mastered vector analysis. And the reason for that is when they saw a bear to the northwest, they just shoot it with their bow and arrow. But now when they see a bear to the northwest, they shoot an arrow to the north and one to the west, and the bear gets away. So it's, again, corny joke, but almost any bit of mathematics can be humorized if I can coin a verb. And I, as you might suspect, like to do that.
Yeah, and it's fun too because in the mathematical communities, we do have some jokes that are kind of funny only if you know the mathematics. But then what you do in that book is you also kind of break down structures and patterns of just regular humor from stand-up comics and things like that. I am curious though, like with that book, did you have to shop that around and you had the idea and you wanted to write that book, or you had written it and were shopping it around, or was there actually a publisher that kind of was looking for something along those lines?
I wrote it first, and I submitted it to a few places, and University of Chicago seemed very interested in it, and there was a university press, so I went with them. And it was interesting. This was early in my career. I did not yet have tenure, so I didn't make much of a noise about it, since I thought it would be held against me since to write something that was popular, that was read by more than 9 people. It's always dangerous sometimes. So, I think that that's no longer a concern.
Mm-hmm. I want to move into your kind of middle phase of writing where you had some bestsellers that really started to take off and with larger publishers. In my view of your work, it seems like a lot of your books have a theme of intersecting mathematics and then also sometimes statistics, probability, with other topics. So mathematics and humor, for example. There's also mathematics and news or journalism that you did in The Mathematician Reads the Newspaper. You intersected mathematics and religion in the book Irreligion, which is one of the ones that I really resonated with when I was starting to read your work. You did mathematics and the stock market, and then recently mathematics and biographies. So I just wanted to ask you, like, is this how you kind of approach things, as this intersection between mathematics and other topics, and is that how you get your inspiration?
To a large extent, yes. I've always liked the idea of rubbing together incongruous subjects and see what comes out of it. It seems to be a kind of necessary, it's not sufficient, but a necessary condition for generating creative ideas. And sometimes this results in eye rolls from people who are sometimes even a bit of vituperation from people who don't like their subjects viewed by someone outside the field. But in any case, I think mathematics is a most productive way at looking at the world. I've always felt constrained and feel that other people are constrained by a very myopic notion of what mathematics is. As I've written elsewhere, mathematics is no more computation than literature is typing. And nobody says, "Oh, you're a great typist. You might as well write a novel," or "You're a bad, horrible typist. Forget your novel." And yet, I think mathematics is sort of in the same boat. I also always liked a quote by Wittgenstein, in which he says he looked forward to the day when philosophy ceased to exist as a subject, but all other subjects were viewed philosophically. I don't want mathematics to disappear, but I think mathematics is not just a noun. I think it helps to think of it kind of as an adverb. Look at almost anything else mathematically. As I say, that's what I've tried to do in at least some of my books. And not just probability and statistics, but logic and chaos theory, the other areas of mathematics that have resonance in the outside world.
Yeah, and so you mentioned mathematics is a valuable way of looking at other areas, but you also, in A Numerate Life, you talk about how sometimes people put an exaggerated trust in math and science. And so I was wondering kind of where that line is. Like, do you think mathematics is a good perspective to bring to bear on anything? Or do you think there are some domains where it's maybe not appropriate or useful to intersect it with mathematics?
Oh, there's certainly some domains where it's less useful. So in some areas, journalism perhaps being one of them, or public policy, mathematics has a lot to contribute. I think it has much less to contribute in, I don't know, abstract art, for example, although there are programs that their creators claim have fooled people.
Hmm.
But but math, numbers in particular, aren't just for decoration. They convey information, and people tend to forget that. But there are differences. You also talk about the distinction between stories and statistics. They not suffer, but they possess different logics. Mathematical logic is extensional. A set is determined by its members, and equals can be substituted for equals without changing the truth value of whatever it is you're talking about. But that's not true in stories. I mean, in mathematics, wherever there's a 3, you can substitute it for the largest integer less than pi, or the square root of 9, or the cube root of 27. Everything still goes through.
Hmm.
In stories, that's not the case. It'd be kind of silly if somebody said, the happiest day of my life was Millard Fillmore's 174th birthday, even if that happened to be the woman's wedding day.
Hmm.
Storytelling is not extensional. Stories are not extensional. There are lots of different aspects to their logic, some different mindsets. Storytellers are much more likely to accept false positives, and scientists false negatives. And when you tell a story, what do? You suspend disbelief, whereas you do science or mathematics, you should, and practitioners do suspend belief, because they don't want to be fooled. They don't want to be bamboozled. There is an interesting interplay between story, statistics, or to vary the alliteration between numbers and narratives.
Yeah, I'm enjoying your biography, A Numerate Life, where you bring up some of these ideas about storytelling and about biography and about why do we trust biographies so much. And it's maybe because we are going into the suspension of disbelief when actually maybe we should be a little bit suspicious of people's memories and things like that. You also bring a mathematical perspective to biographies in the sense of having a lot of points of data, all of these events of your life and how you remember them and everything. But then to write a biography, you're sort of just fitting, a line of best fit or fitting some sort of curve through the important points. But, then you kind of ignore the data that doesn't fit that curve and you sort of follow the narrative curve through. So that's kind of fun for me to think about, or just your approach to biographies. So let's take some time to talk about your biography, A Numerate Life. I want to actually talk about some of the math teachers that make appearances in the book. You've had some positive experiences with math teachers, but also some negative experiences when you were a student. I was wondering if you could just share some of those memories about you as a math student.
Yeah, one I begin the book with is occurred when I was about 10 years old. The class was discussing sports records, and the teacher was this kind of martinet. He had a big bulbous red nose and hulking presence and kind of intimidating in a way. Anyway, we were talking about sports, and I mentioned that there was a relief pitcher for the Milwaukee Braves who had an earned run average of 135.
Hmm.
And I didn't explain it to him, but I said that the pitcher had allowed 5 runs to score and had only retired one batter before he was pulled.
Mm-hmm.
So 5 divided by 120 divided by 127th is 135. Anyway, he got almost angry, visibly angry, and said, "Sit down, sit down. You can't have a earned run average higher than 27. That's just impossible." And I kind of sat down. The way he said it so emphatically and with his big bulbous nose. Anyway, later in the year, the Milwaukee Journal published the final statistics regarding every player, and this player had been sent down to the minors
Mm-hmm.
and never returned. And it said, see, everything, and it said, look, here's the guy, and he's got an earned run average of 135. And I brought it up in class with the newspaper, and he told me, sit down, sit down. But the realization that I had was that I was little and my voice quivered and I had a kind of red face and he was this big kind of hulking guy. But I was right and he was wrong, and I knew it, he knew it. And it just hit me that the little logic and a little math, you don't have to be big to vanquish bullies. So I mean, it's a funny lesson to take. I mean, people always talk about very supportive teachers, which should be applauded, of course. But there is no royal road to mathematics education. And in a way, I don't want to overstate his effect, but he kind of set me on my path towards mathematics and its implications for the world, for the external world, public world. And so it's hard to be really doctrinaire about the math wars. There's no, as I said, no royal road to mathematical pedagogy. Different things work for different kinds of people. Everything from rote learning, which in general I don't like, to more freewheeling applications, which in general I do favor, but depends on the person, on the teacher, on the situation.
Mm-hmm. I want to share one quote from the book where you're talking about this teacher as part of the story, and you say, his idea of good education apparently was to make sure everyone remained seated. That's a good line, and I think I've seen some of those teachers in my experience as well.
Yeah, I'm sure most people who take mathematics or even go on, I mean, remember them kind of vividly. I mean, they're an illustration of what's wrong, and sometimes that's almost as effective as what's right.
Mm-hmm. I want to also pick up this thread about math education and go back to the metaphor that you mentioned earlier about typing versus writing. And in mathematics, a lot of times it can just be computation or procedural execution instead of doing the rich thinking of mathematics and generating ideas and critiquing those ideas, building arguments. And then also I want to kind of connect this to how you're taking mathematics and you see it as a valuable way to look at the world, make sense of the world, critique the world, that sort of thing. So I want to just see if you can say a little bit more about the relationship between your work and the work of mathematics educators in schools. So if there are math education scholars and also teachers who are trying to bring in rich problem solving, bring in sense making with their students instead of just typing, instead of just computation, do you feel that that connects with or resonates with what you're trying to do with your books about bringing mathematical thinking and applying it to things in the world?
Yes, I do think so. I mean, I think there should be some involvement with the material, some exploration of its connections to things that perhaps students are more interested in, and that I think mathematics should appear in some form or another throughout the curriculum. And as I say, I don't want to particularly take sides in the so-called math wars. Happily, the term isn't used as often as it was. Mm-hmm. But I mean, you mentioned journalism. I mean, math and the media and journalism. I think to the standard litany of journalistic questions: who, what, when, where, why, how, and so on, should be added. How many? How likely? Is the rate going up or down? What's the possible downside? I mean, the answers to these questions are often known. They don't have to appear in the lead to the story, but somewhere fairly high in the story, they should appear if they're known, to give the story some heft, some muscularity, and not just be anecdotal. And for other areas as well, in the stock market, there's lots of standard sorts of stuff in various ways in which mathematics plays a role, but kind of more general story ways that emphasize logic rather than computation. I mean, for example, the efficient market hypothesis, that the market immediately takes account of any sort of movement, any sort of news about stocks. It's true to the extent that most investors believe it to be false. Like, that's in a sense a mathematical statement, but it's not one that you just see in most stock market books. I mean, if investors believe it to be false, they'll scurry around, try to trade and look at what's happening and buy and sell. And by their efforts, the market will become efficient. And if they believe it to be true, they'll say, oh, that's a waste of time. Like the old spoke about the efficient market hypothesis. The guy says there's $100. Two guys are walking down the street, two economists. There's $100 in the gutter there. And the other one says, no, if it really were, it would have been picked up by now. But in any case, I think storytelling puzzles are ways to really induce an appreciation for and an interest in and a desire to learn more mathematics. And it's not just an isometric exercise. It has connections, which is not to say that there should be no emphasis on computation and so on, but given calculators and all the software that's available now, there's little reason to emphasize those computational aspects. I mean, most of the the algorithms and procedures that people learn, even as an undergraduate, are now so easily done online without too much understanding that, again, a lot of effort should not be devoted to them, but how to use them. I mean, even I hear people in the hall sometimes that are talking about some statistical program. And, I hear them talk about the p-value, and if I'm in the elevator, it's clear they don't know what p-values are. I mean, you might critique them for various reasons, but it's not the probability. The null hypothesis is true, which is what so many people, even researchers, think. Mm-hmm. So, again, any way in which you can induce interest, whether puzzles, jokes, applications, is to be applauded, because in general, people are interested, most people are interested in all kinds of things, but often not mathematics. But if you can tie mathematics to something which is more interesting, that's a good thing.
And the way that I kind of see your work going is you don't just extract some mathematical content and then have it kind of in a contrived situation off to the side. You actually just bring a mathematical mindset, and then you keep exploring the actual thing that they're interested in. So if they're interested in journalism, if they're interested in humor, whatever it might be, you actually keep the focus on that humor and the journalism in ways that are actually important for those areas, but you have a mathematical mindset, and you can just sort of be like, oh, if from a mathematical perspective, I notice this, or I make this connection, or I make this critique. And so for me, it's more about thinking and approaching things in a mathematical way, rather than just trying to pull out a small piece of math content and then using that to sort of drill the content.
Right, yeah. The latter is kind of the analog of artificial problems about trains going towards each other at 80 miles an hour, and how at 200 miles apart, when will they, I mean, it's nice to be able to do that, but it's not all that inherently fascinating.
Yeah, and if you have a student that loves trains, I don't know if that's really tapping into their true interest.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I don't think that is.
My guest is John Allen Paulos from Temple University. You can learn more about his various books and other works at johnallenpaulos.com. And I want to go again for just another moment or so on Enumerate Life. I was just curious, your process for putting together the book, because you kind of critique biography writing itself, you critique memory, but yet you're also sharing your memories and your biography. You fold in nuggets that you remember from things you've read and things you've done. And I'm just wondering, how did you go through that process? And also, I'm kind of curious, how do you keep track of all your little one-liners and your little anecdotes and quotes that you've read from other people? Do you do that in a little notebook that you have, or do you do it in your mind, or how do you pull that together?
To get the general question first, as I write, I mean, memories are often inaccurate. I mean, I've talked to so many people, friends, relatives, and I know what they quote remember is just not the case. I mean, they're either inaccurate by accident or they're fabricated. They have biased perspectives, so no matter what they look at, they're going to see the same thing. The laws, assumptions are usually unfounded. The contingencies that their story depends on are unpredictable. And as I also talk in the book a little bit about even the very notion of self is suspect. I mean, of course, the idea goes back to Buddha and Hume, but nevertheless, I think it's relevant now with the advent of AI. But nevertheless, I've always liked biographies. I like the nutritionist who secretly enjoys candy and donuts. I've always enjoyed reading autobiographies from Boswell to Mary Carr's Liar Club and so on. So with a lot of trepidation, I decided to write this mathematically flavored quasi-memoir. And the structure of it is I generally talk about some aspect of my personal life, some incident or attitude, and then bring in mathematics that's relevant or even just a metaphor for the idea in a kind of more abstract form. So there's this back and forth between the personal and the abstract. And I talk about, as you get older, you get jaded. And there's a way to illustrate jadedness with the flipping of coins and the record setting. There's Kruskal's trick, which is an interesting trick in its own right, the way people become locked into various patterns in numbers or words. You can use it to, if you remember from your religion, to construct a kind of religious hoax. Even a phrase my father used to really like. He said that there are two kinds of people in the world, those who are very strange and those you don't know very well. And I illustrate the latter with the idea that if you look at the outer edge of a circle, let's say a circle has a radius an inch, the last centimeter or so around the edge constitutes a small part of the circle. But if you go to a sphere, the outer edge becomes a larger part of the volume. If you look at hypercubes of higher and higher dimensions, the part within, again, with a radius 1 foot, the part that's within 1 centimeter of the edge soon dominates everything. So in that sense, everybody's close to the edge. Everybody is strange. And again, that's the structure of the book. It's personal experience, idea, attitude, and then the mathematics that I think sheds some oblique light on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I liked that passage about that we as complex human beings have so many dimensions of personality and experiences and traits that once you realize we have that many dimensions, we're actually much more up in the hypercube situation because we do have lots of dimensions. And so it's very, very likely that on some or one of those dimensions, you are actually in the kind of outlier territory.
Right. We're all strange. Some more than others, of course. But I also talk about hypocrisy. I mean, hypocrisy is, of course, a bad thing. And if anybody who writes at all, especially on Twitter, sooner or later will be accused of it. But I write using various mathematical notions from logic that, in a sense, hypocrisy is inevitable. It's unavoidable. You can't tell when a set of sentences is consistent, even in propositional logic, much less in predicate logic. They're all examples, again, of strangeness, environmentalists who nevertheless do this, and libertines who nevertheless are against that. But I think it's interesting that hypocrisy, taken literally, you can't really avoid unless you're a supercomputer, and even then.
Yeah, I feel like there's hypocrisy of kind of your actions and your words not necessarily aligning, and then there's also contradiction where you might make a claim and then later make the opposite claim, and it's like it's impossible for you to have both of those or both of those be true. And I do feel like in my observation of political conversations and things that are going on now, it seems like the contradictions are getting closer together in time. Like somebody might say something, for example, a political leader might say something and then contradict it either the next day, the next week, or sometimes even just later in the same paragraph.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I do feel like our population, or not enough of our population, has a kind of a alert system or has problems when contradictions arise. I think for you and I, if we saw not just hypocrisy, but we saw a contradiction where we know, like, wait a minute, this means this can't be on the level, or this can't, be consistent with what they're telling us. It seems like a lot of the population doesn't seem to care at all about contradictions, and it doesn't cause them consternation like maybe it should.
I agree. I mean, there are certain obvious ones. The issue, though, is if it's very complicated, it's hard whether to determine. In fact, it's NP complete would determine whether some complicated combination of simple propositions connected it by and or not. There's a way to assign truth to them so that their complicated combination is true. The problem's decidable, but it's called the Boolean satisfiability problem, but it's still NP complete, which is really really hard. So, but yeah, I agree. I mean, in present day time, you don't have to go to such elaborate lengths. I mean, this especially when truth seems to be held in such low regard by Trump and many of his supporters who either lie themselves or don't care that he's lying. And you can't really point to some, special little mathematical fact. Oh, there's a mistake about conditional probability, or you don't understand about this or that. He says X when it's clear that it's not X. I mean, there's no way you can critique that except to say you're wrong with the capital W. I mean, societal innumeracy is still an underrated driver of bad politics, which is I was getting at with that. I mean, simple logic, conditional probability, this hyped concern with foreign terrorists when there's hardly any, Muslim ban, caravans is a big thing. No, it's not. Guns killed so many people, tax cuts, deficits up 50%. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are 50 to 100 times the annual budgets of the National Science Foundation or the Food and Drug Administration, and big issues like climate change, infrastructure, education, the way it's funded, gerrymandering. Those aren't, people don't pay attention to them, even though mathematically, using the word loosely, they're much more important. But anyway, okay, end of little sermon. Sorry.
No, yeah, I think that is one thing we can, as a society, get really fixated on certain problems, especially when people are pushing those problems to the forefront. But it's really kind of important to step back and say, okay, wait a minute. Statistically, or looking at the data, which are actually the most pressing problems, which affect the most people, which are going to make the most difference in the near term, in the medium term, in the long term. And yeah, I think if you step back and do that evaluation, you'll realize a lot of our attention is going to pretty small, minor things, but it's hard to call them minor problems because some people care so much about them. So there's also the kind of personal dynamics of minimizing what somebody feels is a very important problem.
Yeah, right. And that is a complication, of course. But nevertheless, climate change, gerrymandering, infrastructure, education, so on, is vastly more important than caravans.
Yeah. I agree with you on that. I do want to finish with a more lighthearted question here at the end. So, if you were not in mathematics and these mathematics-related activities that you've been doing as your career, is there something else you could imagine doing instead?
Good question. Even now, I often ask myself what I'm going to do when I grow up. Happily, at least in a sense. I haven't grown up all that much yet. But anyway, maybe I'd be a writer of some sort, or it might be presumptuous to use the term. I'd like to be some kind of gadfly, a la, let's say, Bertrand Russell. But it's hard to say. I mean, there's, life's turns are very contingent, and it's hard to predict one's future from one's past sometimes. And even the question is, I don't know. I would some kind of writer. I did math and humor, yes, about that early on. I did do some stand-up a few times and realized how long 3 minutes is. and that my jokes aren't the type that go over to in an audience that's drinking. But anyway, something in this vague, nebulous sort of writer gadfly vein is what I would do.
Hmm. Well, John, thanks so much for taking the time to speak about us. And I also just want to say personally that I've enjoyed reading your works. When I'm in your book, I'm just having a good time. It's funny, it's insightful, it makes me think about things differently. So I'm also just a fan. I've really enjoyed talking to you about it.
Oh, well, thanks so much for the kind words, Sam. I really appreciate them.